Give me the view from Joe Biden.
Well, Nicole, I mean, it's just been sort of a whiplash period for all of us following the Biden campaign. A week ago at this point, we were about to release a poll that showed Joe Biden in single digits with just a single-digit lead over Bernie Sanders in South Carolina. And if that was true and if that held, there were a lot of folks on the Biden campaign who didn't think they'd even be around for Super Tuesday at that point. And all of a sudden, we're in a situation where this is just party is beginning to coalesce around him in a big way so quickly that it's hard to keep our heads on straight here. What's interesting is I even just talking to the vice president in some private moments before we began the interview, there's a focus and sort of a calm around him that I haven't even seen in him in a while. I asked him to talk about, the fact that we saw Mayor Pete drop out, his conversation with him last night. He said that he encouraged him to stay involved in the race. He was coy about whether he asked for his endorsement. I asked him about whether he's involved personally in efforts to try to consolidate the rest of the field around him, whether on the eve of Super Tuesday he was talking to the likes of Amy Klobuchar or others. This was 10 minutes before, by the way, the word would leak out that Amy Klobuchar was, of course, going to endorse him and join him tonight. And I have to tell you, Nicole, that I wasn't planning to go to Dallas tonight. He has one more event here. We were going to skip ahead to California to be in position for Super Tuesday, where he's going to be tomorrow. But the Biden team across the board has been strongly encouraging me to join there tonight. It's almost like they're building an Avengers sequel in Dallas tonight. And so we're interested in what's about to happen. But there's clearly an interest on the part of many in the party. And by the way, including potentially even President Obama himself, to try to hurry this race to a finish. There's a lot of conversations that have been happening, including some involving the president himself, that suggest they don't want to wait for Super Tuesday. They want to begin this process as soon as they can.
Well, you just dangled something really riveting in front of me. Well, tell me more about the conversations with former President Obama. Is that what you said?
Well, we know that the former vice president talked to him over the weekend. Yeah, we know that the former vice president talked to him over the weekend. And that, Craig Melvin asked Biden last week about why President Obama wasn't sending more smoke signals up in terms of his support for Joe Biden. And Joe Biden again said to me today that he said, I know you don't believe it, but I really did ask the president not to endorse me. He wanted to be able to show that he earned this on his own right, on his own merits. But when you saw last week President Obama's lawyers react to the TV ad that was being run in South Carolina that used his own audio, that's a step that they hadn't necessarily been taking. That was potentially a smoke signal. We know that he's been also working the phone lines, potentially speaking with other candidates as well. There's a way that President Obama could have an impact on this race without ever explicitly saying the words about what he wants to happen. And I think that's a lot of Democrats are taking those signals. For instance, we see Susan Rice is a person who, when she comes out today and announces she's endorsing, as somebody who covered the Obama administration and knows how close they are, that's something that I don't think happens unless there's sort of a spirit around the president suggesting that that's an outcome he's happy to see.
And we just put up her tweet. That's right. I mean, having worked for a president who I think only endorsed in the messy Republican primary because his brother was running, George W. Bush endorsed Jeb Bush. I know how reluctant they are because they think they can play a role in bringing the two halves together. But you're right. There's a whole bunch of there are a whole bunch of sort of sub-presidential endorsement things. And any outreach to Michelle Obama, it's my understanding that Jill Biden and Michelle Obama had a pretty close rapport.
They absolutely have a very close relationship. I haven't heard necessarily about any outreach between those, but I know that they're still in touch regularly, as by the way, Obama and Biden have been as well. So, but it's worth paying attention to. I think these kind of signals coming out. Harry Reid is another endorsement coming out today that he was also somebody with a close relationship with President Obama in the White House.
All right, Vaughn Hilliard.
One more thing,
ahead,
Nicole,
ahead,
I should
Mike.
mention.
Yeah.
One other thing, and just in terms of the tea leaf reading that we're doing a lot of right now, when I asked the vice president in my interview with him earlier today about whether or not he thinks Obama would have to step up sooner than the convention in order to help unite the party, he said that he knows that the president wants to do that, that he thinks he'll be there when he needs to. But Biden also said something important, and I think that what we're seeing over the last few days, which is he needs to be the one to also be the figure who can ultimately unite the party, and he intends to do that, he said.
I want to ask you, Vaughn Hilliard, short of a Barack Obama endorsement, a Pete Buttigieg endorsement is pretty darn good. He gave one of the most eloquent and elegant speeches last night I've ever heard for someone coming short of a dream of winning his party's nomination. How did he arrive at the sequencing of withdrawing from the race last night and making the endorsement, as we expect, as other news organizations have reported, he's expected to do tonight?
Yeah, there's a private plane set up just down the road at the South Bend Airport, destined for Dallas here this evening. He would be joining Amy Klobuchar. I talked to multiple campaign officials who said, look, the path to winning the nomination was very, very narrow. And this was an individual who got in to the race hoping that he could be a different sort of candidate, play a different sort of politics. If you're looking for an exact opposite of Donald Trump, you find that in Pete Buttigieg. But it came to that point where, and we should note, outside of drawing contrast with Bernie Sanders and, of course, a little squabble with Amy Klobuchar on the debate stage in Nevada, you haven't heard Pete Buttigieg go after the former vice president pretty much the entirety of this 2020 year, which when you're looking at back, it was the morning of the Nevada primary that I'll go back to. I had a conversation with Pete Buttigieg, and he told me that there was a reality that we all, the party, could be waking up on the morning of March 4th, this Wednesday, the day after Super Tuesday, with Bernie Sanders holding an insurmountable delegate lead. He needed to perform well among communities of color in Nevada and South Carolina. He did not. In terms of having a permission structure to go beyond, the campaign realized they did not have that. They were no longer second in national delegate count. And when you were looking, frankly, at the congressional districts around the country, it just wasn't there for them. And so when you're having that conversation over generational contrasts, Pete Buttigieg, Nicole, like to say on the campaign trail, the Democrats who have won the presidency over the last 50 years were all younger candidates who all had a different style of politics. So now it's going to be on Pete Buttigieg to go and make the case on behalf of 78-year-old Joe Biden.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.